Introduction. Why Joan of Arc? At this point you might be wondering, what does a medieval French teenager fighting a war 600 years ago have to do with my chronic pain, my lab results, or my physical healing? The answer lies in the striking parallel between Joan's natural disqualification and her spiritual authority. Joan was an entirely uneducated, illiterate peasant girl from a tiny border village. In the natural world, her resume was a completely blank sheet of paper. She had no wealth, no military training, no political connections, and zero natural influence. By every human metric, she was completely unqualified to alter the destiny of a nation or command seasoned generals. We use Joan's story throughout this book for three vital reasons. 1. To demolish the lie of your natural resume. When you are sick, the enemy loves to audit your natural history, your weak faith, your lack of theological education, your past mistakes, or your family's genetic track record. Joan's life is the ultimate proof that heaven does not check your human resume before issuing a mandate. If an illiterate farm girl can carry the authority of a king, then your natural limitations cannot stop the healing contract from working in your flesh. 2. To illustrate unearned, gifted authority. Joan did not win her battles because she grew into a powerful warrior. She won because she wore armor provided by the king and carried a standard authorized by heaven. She represents the believer who stops trying to manufacture their own goodness and instead learns to step onto the porch wearing the gifted righteousness of Christ. When the squatter looks at you, he shouldn't see your natural identity, he should see the gleaming armor of the king. 3. To model the aggressive shift from defense to offense. For 7 months, the professional French military sat terrified behind the walls of Orléans, passively managing a siege and waiting to die. This is exactly how many believers live, passively managing their chronic symptoms and coping with their misery. Joan completely shattered that atmosphere in just 4 days by launching an aggressive, unrelenting offensive campaign. Her journey provides the exact tactical blueprint you need to stop playing defense against sickness and start enforcing its total eviction. The map of the journey. As you read through these chapters, Joan's historic milestones will serve as a visual, living map for the legal mechanics of covenant healing. The peasant of Domremy, learning to disregard your genetic background and earthly history to operate entirely from a heavenly lineage. The interrogation at Poitiers, discovering how to bypass the enemy's behavioral audit and lean completely into an unearned spiritual authority. The siege of Orléans, shifting your daily prayer life from defensive survival-based coping requests to an aggressive offensive advance. The coronation at Reims, establishing the absolute undisputed sovereignty of the crowned king over every inch of your physical frame. The rigged trial of Rouen, learning to recognize the mental interrogation chair of condemnation and refuse the enemy's fraudulent legal claims. The trial of nullification, recognizing that the handwriting of requirements against your body has been legally wiped out, obliterated, and burned in the highest court of the universe. You do not lack the authority to walk in full, vibrant health. You are not an orphan trying to beg for a scrap of vitality. You are a legally authorized child of God. The document of condemnation against your flesh has been permanently burned in the heavenly archives, and the resident engine of resurrection life is already fully installed inside your spirit. It is time to stop sitting in the interrogation chair of self-doubt. Put your shoulders back, pick up your title deed, and hold up the victorious standard of the cross until every single symptom breaks camp, drops its chains, and runs off your property forever. The courtroom is closed. The verdict is in. It is time to enforce the contract. In the book we are using the term, the gift of rightness, as a shortened version of the gift of righteousness. Chapter 1. The paper on the porch. Imagine walking out your front door tomorrow morning, coffee mug in hand, and finding a piece of paper lying on your porch. You pick it up and realize it is a legally certified, fully executed deed to a beautiful piece of land. The document has your name printed clearly on it. The purchase price is marked as paid in full, and it bears the official stamp of the highest court in the land. That property belongs to you. Legally, the matter is completely settled. But as you look out across the lawn of your new property, your eyes widen. There is a broken-down trailer parked right in the middle of your grass. A group of aggressive, noisy squatters have set up a campfire, scattered trash across your flower beds, and hung up a sign that says, "We live here now." At that exact moment, you are forced to deal with a massive gulf between two very different realities. The legal reality: the paper in your hand says you own every square inch of the soil. The physical reality: your eyes and ears tell you that someone else is currently occupying and ruining your land. This is the exact layout of the healing fight. This is where the average believer gets stuck, standing on the porch, looking back and forth between the legal document of the Word of God and the loud, painful symptoms occupying their physical body. The Jordan River and the giants. This gap between a heavenly promise and a physical occupation is not a new problem. Centuries ago, the nation of Israel stood at the edge of the Jordan River, facing the exact same dilemma. God had given them a legal deed to the land of Canaan. He didn't say, "I might give it to you if you are good enough." He said, "I have given it into your hand." From heaven's perspective, the transaction was entirely finished. The land belonged to Israel. But when Israel sent spies across the river to look at their new property, the spies didn't find empty cities and open fields waiting for them. They found fortified walls that reached into the sky. They found fierce, battle-hardened armies. They found giant warriors called the Nephilim. The spies ran back to camp in a total panic. They cried out, "We cannot take the land. The people are stronger than we are. We felt like grasshoppers next to them." What went wrong? The Israelites made a catastrophic legal mistake. They assumed that because God had given them the land, there shouldn't be any resistance living on it. They thought that if the promise was real, the giants should have automatically packed their bags and moved away the moment the deed was signed. Because they saw an occupying army, they assumed the paper on their porch was a lie. Healing is an enforcement action. This is the foundational error that keeps millions of believers trapped in chronic sickness. We read a verse like 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 24, which says, "By his stripes you were healed." We see that it is written in the past tense. We recognize that Jesus paid for our physical vitality at the whipping post 2,000 years ago. We accept the paper on our porch. But then, we log onto our computer, handle our day, and suddenly feel a sharp, unexpected tweak in our lower back. Or we walk out of a doctor's office, holding a medical report that uses scary, multi-syllable words to describe a malfunction in our blood work. The moment the physical symptom flares up, we slip right into the old grasshopper mentality of the Israelite spies. We look at the pain and think, "Well, I guess the verse didn't work. If I were truly healed, I wouldn't be hurting. The giants are still in the land, so the deed must not be real." Hear this clearly: healing is not a manufacturing process, it is an enforcement action. Jesus is not looking down from heaven today, deciding whether or not he wants to heal your joints, clear your lungs, or regulate your blood sugar. He already sat on the bench, reviewed the case, and signed the final settlement. He paid the asset in his own flesh. The presence of a symptom in your body does not mean the Word of God failed. It simply means an illegal squatter has set up a camp on your lawn, and they are throwing a loud, desperate tantrum to see if you actually know how to use the paperwork in your hand. The strategy of the squatter. An illegal squatter has no legal right to be on your property, but they have one massive advantage: bluff. If a squatter can convince you that he is too strong to move, or if he can make you believe that the property doesn't actually belong to you yet, you will stop fighting. You will step off your porch, walk back inside your house, and let him run your household. He wins the property simply because you refuse to enforce the deed. Sickness operates exactly like a squatter. A physical symptom is a fraudulent bill being presented by a defeated enemy. It uses pain, exhaustion, and fear to force you into a legal negotiation. It wants you to ask, "Why is this happening to me? What did I do wrong? God, please come down and do something about this." The moment you start begging God to do something He has already finished, you have stepped off your porch and handed the keys right back to the symptom. You are treating your health as a fluctuating variable instead of a settled historical fact. The journey ahead. To walk in perpetual, unbroken health, you have to stop acting like a panicked victim trying to survive an invasion. You have to learn how to stand on your porch like an authorized bailiff who knows their paperwork is airtight. You must learn how to look directly at a chronic diagnosis, an aching joint, or a wave of fatigue, and say, "I see you, but you don't live here. Your lease was permanently destroyed at the whipping post. The case was settled 2,000 years ago. Pack your bags and clear the porch." In this book, we are going to look at the life of an ordinary peasant girl who understood this heavenly authority better than the kings and generals of her era, Joan of Arc. Through her dramatic historical journey, we will map out the exact psychological path to becoming fully conscious of our gift of rightness, learning how to silence the enemy's courtroom audits, and successfully driving every illegal squatter out of our physical frame. The land belongs to you. The deed is paid in full. It's time to go downstairs, open the front door, and enforce the contract. Chapter 2. The Peasant of Domremy. In the early 1400s, the village of Domremy was a quiet, unassuming place on the eastern border of France. It was a town of small stone houses, patchworks of green fields, and rolling hillsides dotted with grazing sheep. Life here was measured not by grand political movements, but by the seasons, sowing crops, shearing wool, and tending to the hearth. In this obscure setting lived a completely ordinary girl named Joan. Joan was entirely uneducated. She could neither read nor write. She spent her days helping her mother spin wool, sewing garments, and occasionally looking after her father's cattle. If you had walked through Domremy in 1424, you would have seen a teenager who looked exactly like every other peasant child in the region. She had no wealth, no military connection, no high-born family lineage, and absolutely zero natural influence. But around the age of 13, everything changed. While standing in her father's garden under the midday sun, Joan saw a sudden, brilliant light and heard a voice speaking to her. The voice did not come from her parents, her neighbors, or the local village priest. It was a voice from heaven. Over the next few years, these heavenly visitations became a regular occurrence. The Archangel Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret spoke to her with absolute clarity. They did not give her simple, comforting thoughts to help her get through her chores. They handed her a staggering, impossible mandate. "Joan, you must leave your village. You must go to the King of France, raise the siege of Orléans, and lead the nation to victory over the occupying English army." The lie of natural history. Think about the sheer absurdity of that request. Domremy was hundreds of miles away from the royal court. Joan had never held a sword. She didn't know how to ride a war horse. She had no strategy maps, no political allies, and no money to travel. If she relied on her natural history, her resume was a blank sheet of paper. This is exactly where the enemy traps the believer who is fighting for their health. When a physical symptom attacks your body, the first thing your mind does is run an audit on your natural history. You look at your family genetics. Well, my father had heart issues, so I guess it's my turn. You look at your past mistakes. I didn't take care of my body in my 20s, so now I'm paying the price. You look at your natural limitations. I'm too old, I'm too weak, or I don't have enough faith to overcome this chronic condition. We allow our natural background to define our current authority. We assume that because we are ordinary, broken, or flawed human beings, we have no right to stand on our porch and order a disease to pack its bags. But look at Joan. When the voices gave her the mandate, she didn't look down at her rough peasant dress or her spinning wheel and say, "I can't save France because I don't know how to read." She didn't let her natural environment dictate her heavenly identity. She chose to believe that the mandate from heaven carried a higher authority than her local village reality. The paradox of the new birth. This is the exact spiritual mechanics of what happens when you are born again. The moment you accept Christ, your old family tree is legally cut down, and you are grafted into a heavenly lineage. As the scriptures state, if anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation. The old things have passed away, and everything has become completely brand new. You might still look like an ordinary peasant in the natural world. You still have the same bank account, the same zip code, and the same physical family history. But deep inside your spirit, a sovereign transaction has taken place. You have been handed a brand new identity from the King of Heaven. You are no longer an orphan trying to beg for a scrap of health. You are a legally authorized child of God with a mandate to enforce life in your physical body. The problem is that most believers continue to live out of their natural history. When a symptom flares up, they try to fight it using their own willpower, their own emotional energy, or their own natural strength. They behave like Joan, trying to fight the English army using her spinning wheel. It is a total mismatch. You cannot defeat a spiritual attack with natural resources. You have to step entirely out of your village history and start operating from your heavenly mandate. Tuning your ears to the higher court. How did a teenage peasant girl walk out of a tiny village and eventually command armies? It started by tuning her ears to the voices of the higher court until the opinions of her village no longer mattered. Her father didn't believe her. Her neighbors thought she was losing her mind. The local authorities laughed at her when she first asked for an escort to see the prince. If Joan had listened to the local chatter, she would have never left the garden. But to Joan, the voices of the saints were more real, more solid, and more authoritative than the doubts of the entire village of Domremy. When you are facing a physical diagnosis, your mind is flooded with village voices. The pain in your tissues screams that this condition is permanent. The medical statistics say most people don't recover from this. Your own anxious thoughts whisper that you are going to suffer just like everyone else did. You have to make a definitive quality choice about which voice holds the final legal weight in your life. You must become thoroughly deaf to the biological reports of the enemy and completely consumed by the past tense contract of the whipping post. You do not lack the authority to heal. You simply need to realize that your authority doesn't come from your natural track record. It comes entirely from the king who signed your deed. Like the young girl in the Garden of Domremy, your natural obscurity is completely irrelevant. You have been drafted by heaven, and the occupying army has to respect the signature on your paperwork. Chapter 3. The Gift of Rightness. When Joan finally gained an audience with the Dauphin, Charles VII, the uncrowned King of France. She walked into a grand hall filled with skeptical noblemen, battle-weary generals, and highly suspicious religious scholars. Charles, testing her claims, had disguised himself and hidden among the crowd while another man sat on the throne. Joan didn't hesitate. She bypassed the decoy, walked directly to the true prince, and knelt before him. The royal court was stunned, but they weren't fully convinced. They immediately subjected her to weeks of intense, grueling interrogation by a panel of elite theologians in Poitiers. They asked her trick questions about scripture, demanded signs from heaven, and scrutinized her morality. They were trying to figure out if she was qualified, if she was holy enough, or if she possessed the religious credentials necessary to speak on behalf of God. Joan's response to their academic traps was legendary in its simplicity. When they demanded a miraculous sign to prove her right to lead, she looked them in the eye and said, "I have not come to Poitiers to give signs. Take me to Orléans, and I will show you the sign for which I am sent." Joan didn't try to win a righteousness contest based on her own theological education or perfect religious background. She knew she didn't have one. Instead, she leaned entirely into an unearned authority granted by the King of Heaven. She didn't need to become a priest to carry the king's seal. She just had to wear the armor he provided. The rightness trap. This historic interrogation mirrors the exact psychological warfare the enemy uses against your mind the moment you try to stand on your porch and enforce healing. The enemy loves to play the role of the religious scholar in Poitiers. The moment you declare that your body is healed by the stripes of Jesus, your mind is bombarded with a courtroom audit. Who do you think you are? Do you think your faith is strong enough? Have you prayed long enough? What about that mistake you made last week? What about that bitterness you held onto this morning? The enemy wants to turn your health into a performance review. He wants you to believe that you have to earn the right to be well. If he can convince you that your rightness status with God is flawed, weak, or incomplete, you will immediately drop the legal paperwork in your hand. You will assume you don't have the standing required to evict the squatter. This is the great religious tragedy of the modern church. Millions of believers are waiting until they feel holy enough, faithful enough, or perfect enough before they dare to command sickness to leave. They are trying to manufacture their own righteousness, hoping that if they accumulate enough spiritual points, God will finally decide to clear their physical frame. The armor is gifted, not grown. To break the power of chronic symptoms, you must understand that your standing before God is not a crop you grow, it is a gift you receive. The Bible calls this the gift of righteousness. It is a legal status of absolute rightness and blamelessness before the throne of heaven, purchased entirely by the blood of Jesus. When you are in Christ, God looks at you and sees the exact same rightness that Jesus possesses. As the scriptures state, those who receive the abundance of grace and the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ. Notice the core phrasing: you reign in life by receiving a gift, not by earning a wage. When Joan finally rode out to face the English army at Orléans, she didn't wear a uniform she had woven with her own peasant hands. She was outfitted in steel armor provided by the royal court, and she carried a sword that had been recovered from behind the altar of an ancient church. When the enemy looked across the battlefield at Joan, he didn't see an uneducated farm girl from Domremy. He saw a gleaming, metal-clad commander carrying the official banner of the Kingdom of France. The armor covered her natural identity completely, enforcing the eviction. When a symptom flares up in your body, whether it is a tumor, an autoimmune attack, or a wave of chronic pain, you cannot answer the attack with your own human resume. You must answer it wearing the gifted rightness of Christ. If you try to evict a sickness based on how well you've behaved this week, you will fail every single time. The squatter will look at your natural flaws and laugh. But when you step onto the porch wearing the armor of his righteousness, the legal environment changes completely. You can look directly at the disease and say, "You aren't auditing my performance. You are dealing with the righteousness of Jesus Christ. I am legally qualified because of the whipping post, not because of my own perfection. The signature on this deed is airtight. Pack your bags and get off my property. Stop trying to get good enough to be healed. You have already been made right enough to enforce the contract. Put on the gifted armor, pick up the paperwork, and command the squatter to clear the lawn." Chapter 4. The Siege of Orléans. By the spring of 1429, the city of Orléans was at its breaking point. It was one of the last major strongholds holding France together. English forces had surrounded the city, building a ring of heavily fortified earthworks and wooden forts, called bastides, to choke off all food, supplies, and hope. For months, the French defenders inside the city had been trapped in a purely defensive mindset. They were exhausted, terrified, and safely locked behind their stone walls. Their entire military strategy was based on survival. If we can just hold out a little bit longer, maybe something will change. They were managing their misery, reacting to every English arrow, and waiting to die. Then Joan arrived. She didn't match the passive, defensive atmosphere of the camp. She didn't come to help them manage the siege. She came to break it. When she rode through the gates of Orléans, she looked at the surrounding English forts and immediately demanded an aggressive, offensive advance. The seasoned French generals were horrified. They tried to hold her back, arguing that they lacked the numbers, the preparation, and the tactical safety to launch an assault. They wanted to wait for the perfect moment. But Joan knew that every day they spent waiting was another day they allowed the enemy to solidify his grip on French soil. On May 4th, without the permission of the cautious military council, Joan rallied the common soldiers and launched a direct, unrelenting charge against the English fort of St. Lou. The sheer, aggressive momentum caught the occupiers completely off guard. The fort fell in hours. Within a few short days, Joan led charge after charge, clearing out one stronghold after another, until the entire English army broke camp and retreated. The siege that had paralyzed an entire nation for 7 months was utterly shattered in just 4 days. The danger of managing sickness. The defensive paralysis that held the French generals captive inside Orléans is the exact same mindset that keeps millions of believers trapped in chronic physical ailments. When a symptom takes root in your body, the natural temptation is to shift into a defensive survival mode. You begin to build your entire life around managing the siege. You study the disease, track the flare-ups, and rearrange your daily routine just to accommodate the pain. Your prayers become purely defensive. "Lord, please just give me the strength to endure this pain today. Please help the medication work a little bit better, so the symptoms are manageable." Without realizing it, you have accepted the presence of the enemy's forts on your property. You are no longer trying to drive the squatter out. You are just trying to negotiate a peaceful coexistence with him. Hear this clearly: you cannot gently manage an illegal occupying army. Sickness has no manners, no mercy, and no legal right to your flesh. If you give it an inch of accommodation, it will take a mile of your vitality. Jesus did not suffer at the whipping post, so you could learn to cope with inflammation, fatigue, or malfunction. He paid the price for a total eviction. Shifting from defense to offense. Joan did not break the siege by hiding behind the stone walls of Orléans and praying for the English to voluntarily leave. She broke it by putting on her armor, picking up her banner, and taking the fight directly to the enemy's strongholds. To see a breakthrough in your physical health, you have to undergo a radical shift in your internal posture. You must stop playing defense against symptoms and start launching an offensive enforcement action based on the Word of God. A defensive posture looks at the symptom and asks, "How do I cope with this?" An offensive posture looks at the symptom and declares, "You do not belong here. This body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, purchased by the blood of Christ. Your presence is an illegal trespass." When you speak to a condition in your body, you are not begging God to attack the problem for you. You are acting as His authorized enforcer on the earth, dropping the weight of a finished heavenly verdict onto a physical reality. You are shifting from a passive victim trying to survive a siege to an aggressive property owner tearing down an illegal camp. The anatomy of a violent faith. The Bible makes a striking statement about how the kingdom of God operates in the earth. Matthew chapter 11 verse 12. And from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. This does not mean physical violence against people. It means a spiritual ferocity that refuses to compromise with the works of darkness. It is an unyielding, stubborn determination that says, if Jesus paid for my health, then I refuse to settle for anything less than absolute freedom in my physical frame. When Joan was wounded by an arrow through her shoulder during the assault on the fort of Les Tourelles, the generals begged her to retreat. The pain was intense, and the natural circumstances looked bleak. But Joan refused to let a physical wound dictate the outcome of the battle. She pulled the arrow out herself, stepped back into the fray, and kept advancing until the fort surrendered. When you begin to enforce healing, the enemy will often throw a counterattack. The symptom might briefly intensify, or the medical report might look worse before it looks better. That is the exact moment you must display a violent, unshakable faith. You don't back down because your tissue hurts or because your mind is flooded with fear. You dig your heels into the soil of the Word, lift up the banner of His righteousness, and keep enforcing the contract until every single symptom breaks camp and runs. The siege is over. The price is paid. It is time to march out and take back your territory. Chapter 5. The Coronation at Reims. Breaking the siege of Orléans was a staggering military victory, but for Joan, it was only the first phase of her heavenly mandate. The ultimate goal was not just to win battles or drive back English soldiers. It was to escort the Dauphin through deep enemy territory to the ancient city of Reims, so he could be formally, legally crowned as the true King of France. To the pragmatic military commanders, this plan sounded completely reckless. Reims was hundreds of miles away, locked deep behind enemy lines, and surrounded by heavily fortified towns loyal to the English crown. The generals argued that it was far too dangerous. Let's secure the surrounding territories first. Let's build up our resources. Let's wait until the road is safe. They were looking at the geography. Joan was looking at the legality. She knew that as long as Charles remained an uncrowned prince, France lacked a definitive, recognized authority. Without a coronation, he was just a contender fighting for a throne. But once the holy oil was poured on his head in the Cathedral of Reims, his authority would be absolute, legal, and indisputable. The war would no longer be a messy dispute between rival factions. It would be a clear-cut case of an occupying army trespassing on the sovereign territory of a legally crowned king. Joan refused to wait. She marched the prince across the country. As they approached the hostile, enemy-held towns along the route, an incredible thing happened. Instead of fighting, the town gates swung open. The sheer momentum of her absolute conviction caused the opposition to dissolve. On July 17, 1429, in a spectacular ceremony inside Reims Cathedral, Charles VII was anointed and crowned. Joan stood right beside him, holding her victorious white banner high. The mandate was fulfilled. The true king was on the throne, and the entire legal landscape of France had shifted forever. The crowned king in your spirit. The journey to Reims perfectly illustrates the shift that must occur in your own heart if you want to walk in enduring physical health. Many believers treat Jesus like an uncrowned prince in their lives. They know he is powerful, they know he won victories in the past, and they love him dearly, but they haven't fully established his legal, sovereign authority over the territory of their physical bodies. They are still treating their health like a gray area, a messy dispute between God's will and a medical diagnosis. When a chronic symptom flares up, they wander in a state of spiritual limbo, wondering, is God trying to teach me something through this sickness? Is it really his will to heal me this time? Maybe it's just my cross to bear. As long as the king's authority is unestablished in your mind, your faith will be hesitant, timid, and weak. You will find yourself constantly negotiating with symptoms instead of commanding them to leave. You have to take the journey to Reims. You have to settle the issue of the coronation once and for all. The moment you recognize that Jesus has already been crowned Lord over every inch of your spirit, soul, and physical frame, the debate is officially over. Sickness is no longer a rival option that has a right to argue with you. It is a defeated, illegal squatter trespassing on the private property of the King of Kings. Enforcing a settled verdict. When Jesus cried out, "It is finished," from the cross, that was his coronation moment over sin, death, and disease. He didn't leave the court open for future debate. He signed the final decree, sealed it with his own blood, and sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. The coronation has already happened in the heavens. Your job on earth is not to try and crown him again through your own begging and pleading. Your job is to stand in your physical body and enforce the verdict that has already been handed down by the highest court in the universe. Colossians chapter 2 verse 15. Having disarmed principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. Notice that the enemy has already been disarmed. Sickness has been stripped of its legal rights, its armor, and its authority over a child of God. When a symptom attacks your body, it is trying to run a bluff. It is pretending that the coronation never took place. It is trying to act as though it still has a valid lease on your flesh. But when you lift up the banner of the finished work of the cross, you are presenting the enemy with the official coronation papers. You are reminding the symptom that its lease was legally cancelled 2,000 years ago. The open gates of breakthrough. When Joan marched toward Reims, towns that should have resisted her for months surrendered without firing a single shot. Why? Because they realized they were fighting an inevitable conclusion. They knew the true king was on his way to his crown, and resistance was entirely futile. When you settle the absolute authority of God's word in your heart regarding your healing, you will see the exact same spiritual momentum. Obstacles that used to feel like massive, unmovable mountains, chronic pain patterns that have lingered for years, medical prognoses that seemed completely permanent, or deep-seated fear, will begin to open their gates and dissolve before you. You will no longer be straining and grinding in your own strength to manufacture a breakthrough. Instead, you will be escorting the authority of the crowned king into the infected areas of your body. Stop treating your health like an open trial. The jury has already returned, the judge has banged the gavel, and the true king is firmly on the throne. Put your shoulders back, lift up your banner, and confidently command every symptom to bow its knee to the sovereign Lord of your life. Chapter 6. The Standard of Victory. Throughout her entire military campaign, Joan of Arc was rarely seen without her most prized possession, a large white linen banner that she carried directly into the thick of battle. The banner was beautiful and meticulously crafted. It was sewn with lilies and featured a depiction of God holding the world, flanked by two angels. To the casual observer, it might have looked like a purely symbolic, decorative, religious flag. But on the chaotic, blood-soaked battlefields of the 100 Years' War, that banner served a vital, tactical purpose. Joan didn't carry a sword into combat to kill people. She intentionally kept her hands occupied by holding this massive standard aloft. Whenever the French lines began to waver, when the arrows rained down, and when the soldiers grew terrified and tempted to retreat, Joan would ride her horse directly to the front line and lift the white banner as high as she could. The moment the soldiers saw that standard rising above the smoke and dust of the conflict, their courage would instantly return. It became a rallying point. They didn't look at the size of the English army or the wounds they were receiving. They fixed their eyes on Joan's banner, locked their shields together, and pushed forward into victory. During her later trial, her hostile prosecutors asked her a trick question. Why was your banner carried into the altar at the coronation rather than those of the other captains? Joan answered with a brilliant, unshakable truth that silenced the courtroom. It had borne the burden. It was quite right that it should have the honor. The burden of the banner. The concept of a military standard is deeply woven into the spiritual fabric of how we overcome physical adversity. In ancient warfare, if a flag went down, the army fell into immediate chaos because they could no longer see where their center of gravity was. The enemy's primary objective was always to take down the standard bearer. When a chronic symptom or a frightening diagnosis attacks your body, the enemy isn't just trying to make your flesh hurt. He is launching a direct, tactical strike against your standard. He wants to lower your gaze. He wants to get you so thoroughly consumed by the fluctuating numbers on a medical chart, the physical sensations in your tissues, and the exhaustion of your mind that you drop your standard of faith and lose sight of the victory. If you fix your eyes entirely on the battlefield, on how bad you feel when you wake up, on how long the recovery is taking, or on what the specialists say, you will naturally begin to waver and retreat. You cannot win a spiritual battle by constantly staring at the enemy's arrows. You have to lift up a standard that rises far above the noise of the symptoms. He has given us a banner. The Bible declares that God has not left us defenseless or without a focal point in the middle of our trials. Psalm chapter 60 verse 4. You have given a banner to those who fear you, that it may be displayed because of the truth. The ultimate standard given to the believer is the finished work of the cross and the absolute reality of God's word. When the symptom screams, you don't argue with the symptom, you raise the banner of the word. When the enemy tells you that your condition is permanent, you lift the standard higher and declare, by his stripes I am healed. When your mind is flooded with the fear of a relapse or a worsening condition, you hold the standard steady and say, He has given me a sound mind, and life-producing energy is flowing through my body right now. Notice that Joan's banner bore the burden. It took the brunt of the wind, it was ripped by arrows, and it was stained with the soot of war, but it never came down. When you make a quality decision to stand on the word of God for your health, that word takes the burden of the situation. You stop trying to carry the heavy weight of healing in your own emotional strength. You let the integrity of God's promise carry the stress of the battle. Your job isn't to figure out how the body is going to repair itself. Your job is simply to hold the standard high and refuse to lower it for any symptom. Holding the line until the finish. Holding a massive linen banner while riding a war horse in full armor required an immense amount of physical endurance. Joan's arms would ache and her body would grow weary, but she knew that if she let that standard drop for even a moment, the men behind her would lose heart. When you are standing for physical recovery, there will be days when your hands feel heavy. The pain might linger longer than you expected, or the fatigue might try to weigh down your confession. That is the exact moment you must refuse to compromise. You lock your gaze onto the promise of God, knowing that His word is a settled heavenly law that cannot fail. The physical body has no choice but to eventually align its operation with the spiritual authority of a standard that refuses to bow. Let the enemy shoot his arrows. Let the symptoms throw their worst tantrums. Keep your hands firmly gripped around the truth of the covenant. The banner has already borne the burden of your sickness on the tree of Calvary, and it is absolutely guaranteed to lead you into the honor of full, vibrant victory. Chapter 7. The Trap of the Periodic Audit. Following the glorious coronation at Reims, Joan of Arc reached the absolute pinnacle of her natural success. She had escorted the king to his crown, shattered the spirit of the occupying forces, and completely rewritten the destiny of France. The entire nation looked at her as an unassailable vessel of heavenly rightness. But behind the scenes in the royal court, a quiet, deadly shift was beginning to take place. The politicians, counselors, and even King Charles himself started stepping away from the raw, unyielding momentum of the heavenly mandate. They began to look out the palace windows and run a series of human, tactical calculations. They counted their remaining gold coins, analyzed the troop numbers, and evaluated the political risks of marching onto Paris. They entered into a phase of periodic auditing. Instead of moving forward with the absolute, past-tense certainty that France belonged to the true king, they started checking circumstances to see if the victory was still practical. They tried to mix heavenly authority with human caution. This hesitation completely fractured their spiritual momentum. The moment the court started auditing their chances instead of enforcing their mandate, self-doubt crept into the ranks, the military drive stalled, and the doors of breakthrough began to close. The anatomy of the body audit. This historical retreat from the border of victory mirrors the exact psychological trap that catches almost every believer seeking physical healing. We call it symptom checking. You can have a magnificent morning in prayer. You can read the Word, feel the armor of your gifted rightness lock into place, and stand on your porch with absolute authority. You know that by the stripes of Jesus, the eviction notice has been signed. The case is legally closed. But then, you step out of your prayer closet and walk into the busy flow of your day. A couple of hours pass, and you suddenly feel a familiar heavy throb in your joint, or a wave of fatigue washes over your chest. Instantly, your mind wants to run a periodic audit. You turn your attention inward, hold your breath, and mentally query your anatomy. Let me check, is it still there? Did that verse actually change anything? Am I feeling any better than I did this morning? The moment you perform that audit to see if the word worked, you have stepped right into the trap of the French court. You have allowed a temporary, physical sensation to pull you out of your secure legal standing and place you right back into the interrogation chair. Reopening a settled case. To understand why symptom checking is so biologically and spiritually destructive, you must look at it through the lens of a courtroom. Once a judge reviews the evidence, bangs the gavel, and issues a final, non-appealable verdict, the case is permanently closed. The attorneys pack up their briefcases and walk out. The matter is no longer up for discussion. Imagine if the prosecutor walked back into the courtroom the next afternoon, tapped the judge on the shoulder and said, "Hey, Your Honor, I just wanted to run a quick check. Are we still totally sure about that ruling from yesterday? Let's re-examine the defendant's symptoms just to see if the verdict is still holding up." The judge would instantly throw that prosecutor out for contempt of court. Why? Because you do not audit a finalized verdict. Every single time you check your body to see if healing is happening, you are telling the courtroom of your mind that the signature of Jesus at the whipping post is not a fixed historical fact. You are treating his finished contract as a fluctuating variable that depends entirely on your hourly biological feedback. You are reopening a case that heaven has permanently closed. The chemical lock of the audit. This mental back and forth doesn't just stall your spiritual momentum, it actively locks the pathology into your physical tissue. Your brain is a highly responsive computer that mirrors your deepest cognitive expectations. When you perform an anxious inward audit, wondering if the pain is still there, your brain perceives that you are under an unpredictable, ongoing siege. It immediately triggers a survival response, flooding your bloodstream with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. This chemical surge places your body's nervous system into a state of high alert. It tightens blood vessels, increases systemic inflammation, and effectively puts your cellular repair mechanisms on a total emergency lockdown. You can make 100 declarations of healing, but if your default mental habit is to constantly monitor and audit the symptom, your brain will keep producing the exact chemical environment required to keep that malfunction running. Your anxiety about the squatter is what keeps the squatter's campfire burning on your lawn. Keep the gavel down. The law of the constant verdict means that you establish a hard, unyielding mental baseline. Your health is a settled heavenly reality, completely independent of ongoing biological reports. When a symptom flares up in the middle of your afternoon, you must train your mind to completely bypass the temptation to check on progress. You do not look inward to see if you are getting better. Instead, you use that pain signal as an immediate trigger to reinforce the finality of the contract. In the quiet theater of your thoughts, without changing your expression, you deliver a cold, internal legal decree. I feel that sensation, but I refuse to audit my flesh. That pain is not a piece of evidence. It is a fraudulent bill from a defeated enemy. I am not checking to see if I am getting healed. I am standing on the fact that I was already bought with a price. Sickness, I am not reopening this trial with you. The gavel hit the bench 2,000 years ago. The contract is paid, the deed is absolute, and I refuse to monitor your bluff. By shifting your focus away from self-examination and keeping your eyes fixed strictly on the legal finality of the word, you stop the emotional and chemical leakage in your biology. You clear the runway entirely, allowing the resident engine of life inside your spirit to quietly, thoroughly crush the enemy's blockade from the inside out. Chapter 8. Captured at the Gate. On May 23, 1430, Joan of Arc led a small, courageous band of French soldiers out of the city gates of Compiègne to attack an enemy encampment. The skirmish was fierce, but as fresh enemy reinforcements rushed onto the field, the French forces were overwhelmed and forced into a frantic retreat back toward the city. Joan, acting as the true commander, stayed at the very rear of her troops to protect them as they scrambled across the drawbridge. But as she approached the safety of the stone walls, a catastrophic event occurred. The French governor of the city, panicked by the sight of pursuing enemy soldiers, ordered the massive drawbridge to be raised and the heavy city gates to be shut. Joan was trapped outside. Within moments, she was surrounded, pulled from her horse, and captured by Burgundian forces loyal to the English crown. For the people of France, this was an absolute psychological crisis. The girl who had broken the siege of Orléans, the girl who had marched the king to his coronation, the girl they believed was completely wrapped in heavenly rightness, was now a helpless prisoner sitting in an enemy dungeon. The French court stood by, completely paralyzed. Their faith in her mandate began to waver. They looked at her heavy iron chains and thought, if she truly had a heavenly assignment, how could she be trapped like this? Maybe we were wrong about her standing from the very beginning. The crisis of the returning symptom. This terrifying moment outside the gates of Compiègne is the exact legal anatomy of a physical relapse. It is the single most dangerous moment in the entire healing journey. You have stood on your porch. You have worn the gifted armor of rightness. You have seen genuine progress. The pain started to lift, the energy began to return, and you felt the initial glorious wave of physical breakthrough. You were convinced the siege was permanently broken. But then, a week or a month later, you wake up in the middle of the night, and a massive, familiar wave of the old symptoms slams right back into your body. Or you go back to the clinic for a follow-up check, and the lab work shows a sudden, unexpected spike in the bad numbers. Instantly, you find yourself trapped outside the gate. Your mind falls into a profound, suffocating theological crisis. The enemy walks up to the prison bars of your thoughts and whispers, "See? It didn't work. Your standing was a fluke. You were never really right with God. If the contract was real, this symptom would never have dared to return." The illusion of the chain. When Joan was thrown into that dark cell, the English army threw a massive victory celebration. They genuinely believed that by binding her physical body in iron chains, they had successfully broken the legal authority of her heavenly voices. But they were making a profound category error. A change in natural circumstances does not mean a cancellation of a heavenly law. Joan's physical capture didn't alter the fact that Charles VII was the legally anointed King of France. Her chains didn't retroactively undo the victory at Orléans. The legal landscape hadn't shifted an inch. The enemy had simply managed to capture the physical vessel carrying the mandate. When a physical symptom flares up unexpectedly, you must realize that it is nothing more than an external, desperate blockade. Sickness cannot undo the legal transaction that took place at the whipping post 2,000 years ago. It cannot rip the signature of Jesus off your title deed. The pain in your tissue is not a legal document, it is an illusion. It is a fraudulent piece of evidence manufactured by a defeated enemy to see if you will voluntarily surrender your legal standing. If the enemy can get you to agree with your chains, he can get you to abandon your property without ever firing a single shot. Refusing to confess the capture. The reason France lost their momentum after campaign is that they allowed the natural sight of Joan's capture to overwrite their memory of her heavenly mandate. They started speaking the language of defeat. They began to negotiate, hesitate, and accommodate the enemy once again. When an unexpected physical setback occurs, your most critical assignment is to refuse to change your confession. You do not stand over your bed and say, "Well, I guess I'm sick again. I guess the healing didn't stick." The moment you say that, you are legally signing the transfer deed and handing the property right back to the squatter. You are agreeing with the prison cell instead of the court verdict. You look right through the bars of that symptom, hold your paperwork high, and declare, "I see this flare up, but I refuse to let it rewrite my history. This physical sensation is an illegal trespasser throwing a noisy tantrum. My body was bought with a price, and my rightness status is a fixed heavenly fact. I am not a sick person trying to get well. I am a healed person resisting a fraudulent arrest. Sickness, your chains cannot stick to righteous soil. The gavel is still down. Pack your bags and clear the porch." The stability of the border defense. A true bailiff doesn't quit their job just because a squatter throws a rock at the window. A true commander doesn't surrender the city just because the enemy launches a sudden counterattack at the perimeter fence. Your physical frame belongs to the King of Kings. A temporary fluctuation in your nervous system or a painful tweak in your joints does not mean the Word of God has lost its power. It is simply the final, desperate bluff of an occupier who knows his lease has been permanently shredded. Keep your eyes locked onto the title deed. Refuse to sit down in the cell of self-pity or self-doubt. Hold the line, maintain the constant verdict, and watch the authority of the crowned king smash through the enemy's blockade until every single chain falls off your flesh. Chapter 9. The Danger of Self-Manufactured Faith. Once Joan of Arc was locked behind the thick stone walls of her cell, she had plenty of time to look at her situation. She was surrounded by guards who taunted her day and night. She no longer had her shining steel armor, her beautiful white banner, or a roaring army of loyal French soldiers at her back. She was stripped down to the barest natural reality of a young peasant girl facing a certain death sentence. In a situation that bleak, natural confidence is entirely useless. If Joan had tried to survive that dungeon by relying on her own human willpower, her own natural bravery, or a self-manufactured feeling of optimism, she would have broken within 48 hours. Human determination has a very low melting point when it is subjected to the cold, dark pressure of an enemy's stronghold. But Joan didn't keep herself strong by trying to pump up her own self-confidence. She didn't pace her cell, trying to manufacture the feeling of mental toughness. Instead, she leaned her entire weight on a reality outside of herself, the absolute, legal authority of her heavenly voices. Even in the dark, she kept her ears tuned inward. When her captors demanded that she recant and admit she had made it all up, she refused. Why? Because she wasn't relying on her own emotional battery. She was plugged directly into a permanent, heavenly source of truth that the prison walls couldn't intercept. The grind of faith manufacturing. This is one of the most exhausting, hidden traps that well-meaning believers fall into when they are struggling with a chronic physical symptom. We call it faith manufacturing. When the pain is intense, or a diagnosis looks terrifying, the believer assumes they have to look deep inside their own mind and cook up a massive boiling emotional feeling called great faith. They think that if they can just squeeze out enough positive thoughts, read enough books, or shout their confessions loud enough, that emotional energy will somehow convince God to finally step in and fix their tissue. This turns faith into a grueling human work. You wake up every morning and audit your emotions. Do I feel full of faith today? Let me check my anxiety levels. Oh no, I feel a little bit of fear. That must mean my faith is leaking. If my faith isn't perfect, the verse won't work, and the squatter will stay on my lawn. This is a total misunderstanding of how the kingdom of God operates. You are treating your human faith as the actual engine that heals your body. You are trying to use your mind to manufacture a spiritual medication, and when your emotions waver, as they naturally do under physical pain, your entire healing defense comes crashing down. The conduit and the engine. Hear this clearly. Your faith is not the engine that heals your body. Your faith is simply the open pipe that allows a pre-purchased heavenly engine to flow into your flesh. When you turn on the kitchen sink to get a glass of water, you don't stand there trying to use your willpower to manufacture the water pressure. You don't squeeze the faucet handle and think, I hope my positive energy can make this liquid appear. You know that miles away, there is a massive pressurized municipal water system already running. Your only job is to open the valve. The plumbing doesn't create the water. It simply conducts what has already been paid for and installed. The Bible reveals that the ultimate life-producing engine is already fully installed inside your human spirit. Romans chapter 8 verse 11. But if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you. Notice that the engine of resurrection life is not a distant variable floating around in outer space. It is a resident household utility living right inside your frame. It is fully paid for by the whipping post, fully functional, and running at maximum capacity right now. Resting in the contract. Joan of Arc didn't win her battles because she was an extraordinarily confident person in her natural flesh. She won because she believed her heavenly voices were legally authoritative. She trusted the king who gave her the paperwork. You need to stop trying to have great faith in your faith and start having simple faith in the legal finality of the contract. When a symptom flares up in the middle of your day, you don't need to panic and start straining to feel an emotional rush of spiritual energy. You don't need to sweat, yell, or manipulate your feelings. True, unshakable faith is incredibly quiet, cold, and calculated. It is a restful reliance on a historical fact. You can take a deep breath, look directly at the pain pattern in your tissue, and say, I am not straining to heal myself today, and I am not auditing my emotions to see if I am good enough. My feelings are completely irrelevant to this legal matter. The engine of Romans, chapter 8, verse 11 is already running inside my spirit, and it is pouring life into my joints and organs right now. I am simply opening the pipe. I am resting entirely on the signature of Jesus. Sickness, you aren't fighting my willpower. You are dealing with a finalized heavenly contract. Case closed. By shifting your attention away from your own emotional performance and resting your entire weight on the finished work of the cross, you instantly shut down the mental friction and exhaustion in your mind. You step out of the interrogation chair of self-manufactured striving and allow the pressurized, resident life of God to quietly and thoroughly evict every single squatter from your home front. Chapter 10. The Trial of Condemnation. In the spring of 1431, Joan of Arc was brought into a rigged, hostile courtroom in the city of Rouen. Sitting on the bench was Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a man completely loyal to the English crown, surrounded by dozens of elite theologians, lawyers, and judges. The courtroom was not set up to find the truth. It was a carefully designed trap. The English could not dispute Joan's staggering military victories. They couldn't erase the historical fact that she had raised the siege of Orléans or escorted the king to his coronation. Because they could not defeat her on the physical battlefield, they decided to attack her legal standing. They wanted to prove that she was fundamentally a fraudulent, wicked person who had no right to speak on behalf of heaven. For months, the prosecutors subjected this 19-year-old girl to a relentless, exhausting behavioral audit. They didn't ask about her military strategies. They interrogated her for hours about her character, her childhood, the folklore of her village, and her choice to wear men's armor. They twisted her words, dug into her past, and tried to find any tiny flaw, error, or breach of religious discipline to prove she was unworthy. Joan stood entirely alone in that interrogation chair, facing a wall of hostile faces. On May 30, 1431, based on a thoroughly biased and fraudulent trial, the court found her completely in the wrong. They condemned her as a heretic, stripped her of her standing, handed her over to secular authorities, and burned her at the stake in the old marketplace of Rouen. The legal anatomy of a physical attack. This dark courtroom in Rouen is the exact blueprint of how a physical sickness attacks a believer. Sickness is never just a biological accident. It is a legal assault launched inside the theater of your thoughts. The moment a chronic symptom or a terrifying medical diagnosis shows up in your body, the enemy doesn't just attack your tissue. He immediately opens a court case inside your skull. He plays the exact role of Bishop Cauchon, running a fierce behavioral audit on your life. As you lie awake in bed dealing with the pain, the interrogation begins. Why do you think you have a right to be healed? Look at your life. Look at how many times you failed God this week. Remember that secret sin from your past? Remember that anger you let fly yesterday? You don't have enough faith, you don't pray enough, and you haven't earned this miracle. The enemy wants to move you away from the finished contract of the whipping post and drag you onto the slippery ground of your own moral performance. He knows that if he can make you feel guilty, unworthy, or flawed, you will naturally agree with the condemnation. You will accept the symptom as a deserved punishment, step off your porch, and let the sickness burn right through your physical body. Sickness seeks a guilty verdict. Hear this foundational spiritual law clearly. Sickness requires your internal legal agreement before it can permanently occupy your home front. The enemy cannot simply march onto your property and destroy your health at will. He has to trick you into signing over the deed through a verdict of condemnation. He uses the behavioral audit to get you to declare yourself guilty. The moment you think, I guess I'm just not good enough for God to heal me, you have banged the gavel against your own life. You have authorized the squatter to stay. This is why trying to fight a physical disease by auditing your own goodness is a mathematical impossibility. If your health depends on your flawless track record, you will lose the case every single time. You cannot out-argue the enemy using your own resume. There will always be a mistake you made, a word you shouldn't have said, or a moment of doubt you entertained. If you sit in the interrogation chair and try to defend your own personal perfection, the court of Rouen will find you in the wrong, and the symptom will continue to rule your flesh. Refusing the behavioral audit. To break the power of chronic symptoms, you must learn to completely bypass the enemy's courtroom traps. You must refuse to answer the interrogation regarding your personal worthiness. When Joan was asked complex, trap-laden questions about whether she was currently in a state of God's grace, she famously answered, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may He so keep me." She didn't boast in her own merit. She left her standing entirely in the hands of a higher authority. When a symptom attacks your body and floods your mind with your past failures, you do not sit there trying to prove you've been a perfect Christian. You don't try to argue that you deserve a break. Instead, you step completely out of the interrogation chair, point directly to the cross, and deliver a cold, unyielding legal decree. Sickness, I am completely closing down this behavioral audit. You have no legal authority to review my performance or question my track record. My rightness before God is not a wage I earned through my good behavior. It is a flawless, heavenly status gifted to me by Jesus Christ. The cross settled my standing, and the whipping post paid for my physical tissue. I refuse to debate my worthiness with a defeated squatter. You are dealing with the righteousness of the King, and your presence is a fraudulent trespass. Pack your bags and clear the porch. Stop defending your personal history. The trial of your worthiness was permanently settled 2,000 years ago when Jesus took your place on the tree. Put on your gifted armor, pick up your title deed, and refuse to give a single millimeter of legal agreement to a condemned and defeated adversary. Chapter 11. Bypassing the interrogation chair. When Joan of Arc stood inside the stone chapel of Rouen, she faced a carefully orchestrated psychological assault. The courtroom layout was designed to intimidate. The judges sat on elevated benches looking down on her, while she was forced to sit in a low, isolated chair in the center of the room. Every question thrown at her was a high-velocity probe intended to spark fear, confusion, and defensive panic. The judges knew that if they could get her to argue, stumble over her words, or become defensive, they would control the narrative. But as the trial wore on, Joan learned a powerful tactical maneuver. She began to bypass their interrogation chair altogether. When they asked her highly complex, trap-laden questions about theological technicalities, she would frequently refuse to engage on their level. She would look directly at Bishop Cauchon and say, "You say you are my judge. Take good heed of what you do, for in truth I am sent by God." Instead of sitting submissively under their authority and defending her character, she repeatedly disrupted the trial by appealing directly to the highest court, the King of Heaven. She shifted her posture from a defensive peasant trying to clear her name to an authorized messenger reminding her accusers of their own illegal overreach. The mental interrogation chair. When a physical symptom flares up in your body, the enemy attempts to place you in that exact same low, isolated chair inside your own mind. The pain acts as a summons to court. Suddenly, you aren't just dealing with a biological sensation. You are sitting in a silent mental theater where a barrage of condemning questions begins to fly. Why is your body failing? Why didn't the prayer work this morning? What if this is a punishment for your past? What if you never get well? The moment you begin to answer those questions, the moment you start trying to prove your worthiness, explain away your flaws, or anxiously debate why you are sick, you have willingly sat down in the interrogation chair. By entering into a dialogue with the symptom, you are granting it legal standing. You are treating the disease as a legitimate prosecutor who has the right to run an audit on your life. This defensive mental grind doesn't just exhaust your mind, it sends immediate high-alert panic signals down your vagus nerve, throwing your body's chemistry into a state of inflammatory chaos. The chemistry of the high alert. Your brain is designed to constantly monitor your internal narrative. It doesn't know the difference between a real physical threat and a stressful, imaginary courtroom battle taking place inside your thoughts. When you sit in the mental interrogation chair, ruminating over your flaws and panicking about a diagnosis, your amygdala perceives that you are under an active, life-threatening attack. It instantly activates the sympathetic nervous system, turning on the body's emergency alarm. This flood of stress chemicals creates a highly acidic, tense environment in your physical tissues. It restricts blood flow, increases pain sensitivity, and effectively starves your cells of the oxygen and nutrients they need to heal. You cannot experience a heavenly physical clearing while your brain is constantly pumping out the chemistry of a battlefield. To let the life engine of the spirit repair your flesh, you must break the circuit. You must get out of the interrogation chair. Executing the Supreme Court appeal. Bypassing the chair means you completely refuse to participate in the enemy's behavioral audit. You do not argue, you do not defend your record, and you do not panic. You simply shift the entire case to a higher legal jurisdiction. When a pain signal hits your tissue and initiates a wave of accusing thoughts, you do not sit down to debate. You keep your expression calm, take a deep breath, and deliver an internal legal bypass. Sickness, I am refusing to sit in your interrogation chair. I am not entering into a dialogue with this symptom, and I am not defending my personal worthiness to you. The trial regarding my rightness was permanently settled at the cross, and the verdict was marked paid in full at the whipping post. I appeal directly to the Supreme Court of Heaven. I am wearing the gifted armor of Christ, and the resident engine of Romans, chapter 8, verse 11, is clearing this property right now. I refuse to monitor your bluff. The case is closed. Pack your bags and clear the porch. By shifting your attention away from self-defense and anchoring your mind in the settled reality of the contract, you instantly quiet your nervous system. The alarm turns off. The cortisol surge stops, blood vessels relax, and the peaceful, restorative life of God is free to flood your body and drive out every illegal occupier. Chapter 12. Shifting the blame completely. Even when she was bound in chains and facing the burning marketplace of Rouen, Joan of Arc maintained a terrifying clarity about who was actually at fault. Her judges spent months trying to force her to accept personal blame. They wanted her to confess that her imprisonment was her own doing, that her heavenly voices were a delusion born of her own pride, and that she had brought this destruction upon herself. They wanted her to look inward, shoulder the guilt, and declare that heaven had abandoned her because of her own personal failures. Joan utterly refused to take the bait. She did not allow the dark, oppressive circumstances of her cell to convince her that she was under a divine punishment. She didn't look at her chains and assume she had broken some cosmic rule. Instead, she pinned the responsibility exactly where it belonged. She looked directly at her accusers and told them that they were the ones committing a grave sin by resisting the mandate of heaven. She kept her internal landscape completely clean of their condemnation. Because she shifted the blame entirely onto the illegal overreach of her captors, her internal peace remained completely unbroken, even in the mouth of the furnace. The false ownership trap. The enemy's slickest tactical maneuver is to convince you to take emotional and legal ownership of the sickness occupying your physical frame. We call this the false ownership trap. The moment a chronic condition settling into your organs or tissues becomes a permanent fixture in your vocabulary, you have fallen into the trap. You begin to refer to it with personal pronouns. My arthritis is acting up today. My blood sugar is low. My chronic fatigue is coming back. Without realizing it, you are signing the registration papers for the squatter. You are taking the blame for the breakdown. Your mind begins to trace your history to find a logical justification for the disease. Well, I inherited this from my mother's side. I brought this on myself because of how I ate. I am experiencing this pain because I am just a weak, flawed human being. As long as you accept personal ownership of the malfunction, you cannot legally evict it. You cannot drive a squatter off a piece of property if you are actively claiming that the squatter belongs to you. Sickness thrives on your willingness to shoulder the blame for its existence. A sickness is a theft, not an inheritance. To walk in unbroken physical vitality, you must establish an aggressive, unyielding legal boundary in your thought life. Sickness is never your property, never your fault, and never your inheritance. When Jesus stood at the whipping post 2,000 years ago, he did not merely manage your infirmities, he legally carried them away. He took 100% of the blame, 100% of the penalty, and 100% of the physical curse into his own flesh. Isaiah chapter 53 verse 4. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. Because Jesus already stood in the cosmic courtroom and took the absolute blame for every physical breakdown, your body has been completely exonerated. Sickness no longer has a legal warrant to touch your tissue. Therefore, any symptom that manifests in your flesh is not a divine consequence or a natural inheritance, it is a straight-up theft. It is an illegal, fraudulent piece of contraband being smuggled onto your property by a defeated enemy. Executing the total blame shift. Shifting the blame completely means you stop looking inward to find a spiritual or natural reason why you are sick. You stop asking, "What did I do wrong to deserve this?" You pin the entire responsibility for the symptom on the malicious overreach of the adversary. When a pain pattern flares up or a terrifying diagnosis is spoken over your life, you do not sit down in the dirt of self-examination. You do not confess the disease as a part of your identity. You shift the blame immediately and execute a total legal detachment. Sickness, I refuse to take ownership of this breakdown. This is not my arthritis, this is not my disease, and this is not my punishment. I do not own this malfunction, and I do not accept the blame for it. Jesus took my physical liabilities at the whipping post, which means my flesh is completely cleared of all legal claims. This symptom is nothing but a theft and a trespass. I pin 100% of this problem on you, Satan. You are the one violating a sealed heavenly contract. I refuse to carry your contraband. Pack up your camp, extinguish your fire, and get off my property right now. By shifting the blame entirely away from your own record and onto the enemy's illegal trespass, you instantly clear your mind of guilt and anxiety. Your internal landscape becomes perfectly clean, quiet, and peaceful. You take your seat back on the porch as the authorized property owner, allowing the resident engine of life inside your spirit to effortlessly crush the enemy's blockade and sweep your physical frame completely clear. Chapter 13. The Second Court Case. 25 years after Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in the old marketplace of Rouen, the political and spiritual landscape of France looked completely different. The English forces had been systematically driven out of the country, the king was firmly established on his throne, and the raw truth of Joan's mandate had been completely vindicated by history. But a massive, lingering legal problem remained. The official court records in Rouen still contained a finalized, written verdict that branded Joan as a condemned heretic, a fraud, and a criminal. Even though she was gone, her family and her nation refused to let that fraudulent document stand as the official historical record. In 1455, Pope Calixtus III authorized a grand legal proceeding known to history as the Trial of Nullification, or the retrial of Joan of Arc. An elite panel of judges, theologians, and legal scholars convened to re-examine the original trial. They gathered testimony from over 100 witnesses, her childhood friends, the soldiers who fought by her side, and even the surviving clerks who had sat in the courtroom at Rouen. The investigation revealed that the first trial was a completely rigged, illegal operation driven by political malice and systemic fraud. On July 7, 1456, inside the Cathedral of Rouen, the court handed down a definitive, revolutionary verdict. The original conviction was declared completely null, void, and utterly without legal effect. Joan was pronounced entirely innocent, her name was completely cleared, and the original document of condemnation was torn up and symbolically burned. The first verdict wasn't just revised or adjusted, it was nullified. It was treated as though it had never legally existed in the first place. The nullification of sickness. This grand historical reversal is the exact spiritual reality of what happened to your physical liabilities at the cross of Calvary. The enemy loves to walk up to the front porch of your mind and wave an old, terrifying document in your face. He points to your genetic history, your past moral failures, or your physical symptoms and screams, "Look at the record." The verdict of biology says your joints must break down. The verdict of genetics says your heart must fail. The verdict of your past mistakes says you deserve to carry this chronic fatigue. If you don't understand the law of nullification, you will look at that written document of sickness, assume it has legal authority, and submit to the diagnosis. But 2,000 years ago, the highest court of heaven held a definitive retrial over your life. Jesus stepped into the courtroom, took the written record of every curse, every disease, and every physical liability that was stacked against you, and completely nullified the paperwork. Colossians chapter 2 verse 14. Having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us. And he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. The word wiped out, in the original Greek, means to erase, blot out, and completely obliterate a legal document until no trace of the original writing remains. Heaven didn't just give you a temporary medical deferment or a scriptural band-aid to help you manage the pain. The highest court in the universe looked at the enemy's case against your body and declared it completely null, void, and without legal effect. Your body is a closed case. When a physical symptom flares up in your tissues or a doctor hands you a frightening chronic diagnosis, you are looking at a document that has already been legally shredded by the King of Kings. The pain in your body is trying to enforce a verdict that no longer exists in the heavenly archives. It is a fraudulent warrant being served by a rogue, defeated officer. You must train your mind to look right through the natural feedback of your nervous system and treat the sickness as a thoroughly debunked illegal lie. You do not go to prayer trying to convince God to nullify the disease today. You go to prayer to enforce the fact that the nullification was already finalized 2,000 years ago. Enforcing the sovereign nullification. To walk in absolute, enduring physical freedom, you must refuse to give a single millimeter of legal recognition to the enemy's paperwork. You do not debate the symptoms, you do not manage the diagnosis, and you do not panic over a lab report. You present the court with the final ruling of the cross. When a pain pattern attempts to settle into your body, you stand on your porch like an authorized bailiff, hold up the finished contract, and deliver a cold internal legal decree. Sickness, I am serving you with a final notice of nullification. This symptom is an illegal, fraudulent piece of paperwork that has no standing in this house. The handwriting of requirements that was written against my physical body was completely wiped out, obliterated, and nailed to the cross 2,000 years ago. My rightness status is an unassailable heavenly fact, and my flesh is the private property of the true King. I refuse to recognize your diagnosis, and I refuse to negotiate with a canceled contract. Your warrant is void, your lease is destroyed, and your authority is completely zero. Pack up your camp, extinguish your fire, and clear the property right now. Case closed. By anchoring your mind in the settled historical reality of the trial of nullification, you instantly shut down the emotional friction, fear, and anxiety in your thoughts. Your nervous system drops into a state of absolute chemical peace. You step out of the courtroom struggle entirely, allowing the resident engine of resurrection life inside your spirit to effortlessly sweep through your frame, smash the enemy's illegal blockade, and manifest full, vibrant, and unbroken vitality in every single cell of your body. Chapter 14. Banner of Personal Enforcement. Once the trial of nullification was completed, Joan of Arc was no longer a historical casualty or a condemned casualty of war. She was a national standard. Her family name was fully restored, her actions were celebrated as pure heavenly assignments, and her iconic white banner became an enduring symbol of unshakable victory across the land of France. But the legal victory inside that cathedral wouldn't have meant a thing if the people of France had gone back to their villages, locked their doors, and allowed the English forces to slide back over the border. A legal verdict on a piece of parchment is only as good as the army willing to back it up on the field. The victory endured because the nation chose to live out the reality of that court ruling. They didn't retreat back into defensive isolation. They stepped onto the front porch of their country and stood guard, refusing to allow a single foreign outpost to be built on sovereign French soil ever again. This is the final, ultimate phase of your healing journey. You have traveled from the humble garden of Domremy to the royal coronation at Reims, and you have watched the highest court in the universe completely shred and nullify the enemy's paperwork against your biology. Now your assignment is to become a living banner of personal enforcement. You must transition from a patient seeking a miracle to an authorized officer of the court who daily maintains an unbroken state of physical clearing on your home front. The myth of the passive protection. The greatest mistake a believer can make after discovering their legal authority in Christ is to slide into a state of passive relaxation, assuming that because the contract is signed, the enemy will automatically behave himself. We fall into a passive mindset. Well, I know the verse says I'm healed, so I'll just sit back and see what happens. If a symptom comes back, God will surely zap it for me. Hear this fundamental law of spiritual territory clearly. The enemy is a rogue squatter, and squatters do not read legal notices unless they are actively backed by an enforcer on the property. When Jesus declared that the handwriting of requirements against you was blotted out and nailed to the cross, he handed you the official evictions paperwork. He didn't promise that the enemy wouldn't try to sneak back over the back fence in the middle of the night to pitch a small tent. He promised that when you use his name and stand on his contract, the enemy has absolutely zero legal rights to remain. If you are passive, the enemy will slowly reoccupy your tissue. But if you are an enforcer, you stand on the porch and refuse to let him drop a single suitcase on your lawn. The Daily Guard Protocol. To maintain an unbroken state of physical clearing, you must establish an instant automatic defense protocol inside your thought life. You do not wait until a disease has built a massive fort in your organs before you decide to fight. You attack the very first arrow the moment it lands on your perimeter fence. When you wake up in the morning, you do not run a fearful inward audit to see how your body feels. Instead, before your feet even touch the floor, you lift up your standard and set the legal environment for your day. You execute a cold, calculated enforcement routine in the quiet theater of your thoughts. 1. Check your uniform, not your tissue. Remind yourself that you are not an ordinary peasant dealing with a biological breakdown. You are wearing the gifted armor of rightness. Your old natural history is dead, and you are operating under a higher heavenly lineage. 2. Silence the first inbound signal. If a minor tweak, a familiar ache, or a wave of fatigue hits your frame during the day, do not pause to monitor it. Treat it as a fraudulent bill. Use that sensation as an immediate trigger to declare, I see that sensation, but I refuse to audit my flesh. This body is a closed case. 3. Keep the engine open. Do not try to manufacture faith through emotional straining or religious grinding. Take a deep breath, drop your internal weight into the finished work of the cross, and let the resident life engine of Romans chapter 8 verse 11 quietly, thoroughly flood your nervous system with restorative power. The territory belongs to the king. Joan of Arc's legacy didn't fade when she left the earth, because she had successfully introduced a higher law to her generation. The law that an ordinary, uneducated person backed by a heavenly mandate carries more weight than an entire occupying empire. You do not lack the authority to walk in full, vibrant health. You are not waiting for God to decide whether He wants to clear your physical frame. The oil has been poured, the prince has been crowned, and the document of condemnation against your flesh has been permanently nullified and burned in the highest court of the universe. Stop looking back at your village history, stop auditing your personal flaws, and stop sitting in the mental interrogation chair trying to prove your worthiness to a defeated adversary. Your rightness is a gift. Your contract is signed in blood. Your spirit is a powerhouse of resurrection life. Put your shoulders back, step onto the front porch of your body, and confidently hold up the victorious banner of the cross until every single symptom breaks camp, drops its chains, and runs off your property forever. The siege is broken, the case is closed, and the land is entirely yours. Thanks for reading. Tony Egar. Brisbane, Australia. Joan of Arc. Gives our healing faith a boost. Introduction. Why Joan of Arc? At this point you might be wondering, what does a medieval French teenager fighting a war 600 years ago have to do with my chronic pain, my lab results, or my physical healing? The answer lies in the striking parallel between Joan's natural disqualification and her spiritual authority. Joan was an entirely uneducated, illiterate peasant girl from a tiny border village. In the natural world, Her resume was a completely blank sheet of paper. She had no wealth, no military training, no political connections, and zero natural influence. By every human metric, she was completely unqualified to alter the destiny of a nation or command seasoned generals. We use Joan's story throughout this book for 3 vital reasons. 1. To demolish the lie of your natural resume. When you are sick, the enemy loves to audit your natural history, your weak faith, your lack of theological education, your past mistakes, or your family's genetic track record. Joan's life is the ultimate proof that heaven does not check your human resume before issuing a mandate. If an illiterate farm girl can carry the authority of a king, then your natural limitations cannot stop the healing contract from working in your flesh. 2. To illustrate unearned, gifted authority. Joan did not win her battles because she grew into a powerful warrior. She won because she wore armor provided by the king and carried a standard authorized by heaven. She represents the believer who stops trying to manufacture their own goodness and instead learns to step onto the porch wearing the gifted righteousness of Christ. When the squatter looks at you, he shouldn't see your natural identity. He should see the gleaming armor of the king. 3. To model the aggressive shift from defense to offense. For 7 months, the professional French military sat terrified behind the walls of Orléans, passively managing a siege and waiting to die. This is exactly how many believers live, passively managing their chronic symptoms and coping with their misery. Joan completely shattered that atmosphere in just 4 days by launching an aggressive, unrelenting offensive campaign. Her journey provides the exact tactical blueprint you need to stop playing defense against sickness and start enforcing its total eviction. The map of the journey. As you read through these chapters, Joan's historic milestones will serve as a visual, living map for the legal mechanics of covenant healing. The peasant of Domremy, learning to disregard your genetic background and earthly history to operate entirely from a heavenly lineage. The interrogation at Poitiers, discovering how to bypass the enemy's behavioral audit and lean completely into an unearned spiritual authority. The siege of Orléans, shifting your daily prayer life from defensive survival-based coping requests to an aggressive offensive advance. The coronation at Reims, establishing the absolute, undisputed sovereignty of the crowned king over every inch of your physical frame. The rigged trial of Rouen, learning to recognize the mental interrogation chair of condemnation and refuse the enemy's fraudulent legal claims. The trial of nullification, recognizing that the handwriting of requirements against your body has been legally wiped out